Good morning, everyone. My name is Alistair Scott. I've recently become the Executive Director of the Global Rewilding Alliance, and I'm chairing today's event. You're very welcome. Today's topic is how rewilding can assist in climate policy in Southeast Asia, a link that people don't necessarily make. So we have a stellar group of contributors today. First of all, I will introduce the Global Rewilding Alliance, and then Fabien Quétier, who is the head of landscapes at Rewilding Europe, will give a very rapid overview of what is rewilding, because we're aware that many people will be joining who don't necessarily have a clear idea of what rewilding is and how it's distinct from other forms of nature protection. Then we have Dr. Andrew Tilker from Rewild, who will be outlining the concept of animating the carbon cycle and introducing what we call the Yale GRA model, which is a model that can assess predictively how much extra carbon will be drawn down if you reintroduce wild animals into a landscape or a seascape. So Andrew will be taking us through that. And then Pablo Sinovas is the country director for Cambodia at Fauna and Flora International, and will be giving a rewilding practitioner's contribution perspective from Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, our final speaker, Dr. Ashley Brooks, who's the Asia director at Rewild, has not been able to make it for health reasons, but Andrew Tilker will be covering her contribution. And then we're very fortunate to have Mark Haller, the chair of the Global Rewilding Alliance, will give some concluding remarks and wrap us up. So for those who've just arrived, my name is Alistair Scott. I'm recently become the Executive Director of the Global Rewilding Alliance. What is the Alliance? So we were formed 4 years ago on the realization that rewilding was becoming a global phenomenon, and that there was a need for a small catalytic organization that could help support the work of rewilders around the world and connect them up. And so we were formed with support from Rewild and a number of other organizations. And we have a secretariat of about 12, 14 people scattered around the world who support the work of the rewilding movement. We started off with a strategic investment in this field that we now call animating the carbon cycle. And this stemmed from an insight, which is that animals play an outsized role in the global carbon cycle, and that when you reintroduce wild animals into landscapes where they've gone missing, those ecosystems are typically able to draw down much more carbon than without those animals, sometimes up to 10, 20 times as much. And that was our early contribution, working with Oswald Schmitz, who's a professor at Yale University. And I think that gave us a sort of a bit of a presence, really, making that bridge to the climate agenda, which, after all, has so much more traction in the worlds of policy and corporate environmental action. We then grew as a number of organizations signed up to our founding charter, which is called the Global Charter for Rewilding the Earth, which sets out a number of principles for rewilding. Initially, about 120 organizations signed up to that charter. When I joined 2.5 years ago, we were 140. And as of this week, we're just past 250 organizations. We are growing organically and fairly rapidly. About one organization a week is joining. And those organizations generally are finding us because we have a pretty powerful communications function where we are telling the stories of rewilding from around the world. And there's so much good news in the rewilding movement. I think one of the problems with environmental issues is that they've been characterized by so much bad news. And our good fortune in the rewilding movement is that we have visually beautiful and practically optimistic stories of success, bringing back incredible ecosystems and all of the wonderful animals that are part of them. So we have that good fortune, and we make the most of it by telling these stories on a global scale. If you're in an organization that is helping nature recovery and you've not yet joined the Alliance, we would very much welcome you to join. It is free to join, and it's very unbureaucratic. So just be in touch with us afterwards. So that's probably enough about the Global Rewilding Alliance. I'd like to call on Fabien Quétier to introduce rewilding as a concept. Fabien, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen just quickly. I hope everyone can see this correctly. So I was tasked with giving a very short introduction to the term and the concept of rewilding. So I will try to satisfy your curiosity with some concise definitions and perhaps more interestingly, some quick examples of the kinds of things that are done in practice. I'm speaking as head of landscapes at Rewilding Europe, which is a foundation that was established over a decade ago now in Europe and has been pioneering and leading a movement in Europe, which is growing strongly around rewilding as a new approach to conservation and restoration of the continent's wildlife and ecosystems. And we're very happy to be an active member of the Global Rewilding Alliance and having the opportunity today to share a little bit of our work and the lessons we've learned. This movement in Europe, it's growing strongly and permeating the broader public. There's, it sometimes feels like every week there's a new book coming out explaining why we need to rewild the world or rewild this or that country. So a very solution-oriented and hopeful take on the plight of the biosphere, but also of in response to the climate crisis, and in some cases as a new outlook and new perspectives for rural areas in Europe, for example, that have been struggling with rural depopulation or socioeconomic change. So this is a really favorable and intense context in which to work on rewilding. And it goes broader than this. I think several of you may have realized that the global conversation on biodiversity has shifted somewhat from preserving protected areas and conservation to also acknowledging the need for restoration and recovery. I think this graph from 2020 shows what this means in terms of bending the curve of biodiversity loss, sort of reversing this historical trend that of course we're still in. And this has led to some commitments from governments around the world, as well as non-governmental organizations, the corporate world, to foster nature recovery. And so we now have, in most countries in the world, a commitment to nature restoration. And so rewilding sort of sits quite comfortably within that broader context. It's a solution to those challenges. Now, if you look into the detail and you do a little bit of literature search on what rewilding means, why it's different from conservation or restoration, which have been around, of course, for a long time, you'll find a growing number of publications that look at that. Many, especially the earlier publications, were very focused on definitions, sort of trying to work out the difference between rewilding and other practices. You have here some examples from a 2016 paper. But I wouldn't dwell too much on the theory, let's say, but rather look at what rewilding means in practice. And certainly, when you look at what different people are doing, there really are some novelties there. First, it really proposes a new and a positive appreciation of wild nature, which in many countries is still a cultural challenge. In terms of the biodiversity conservation outcomes, it's sort of upending the logic, at least in Europe, of looking at the restoration of natural processes and considering that the species that will then establish themselves in the restored ecosystem are a little bit of an unknown and uncertain outcome of the restoration efforts, rather than the set goal where you do whatever needs to be done to get this or that species established. There's also a very strong dimension of working with people in rewilding, contrary to what some people wrongly believe when they hear the term. Building a new relationship with wild nature, a positive relationship, one where both people and nature can thrive, is a really central element to the rewilding approach. And that I think is very modern in practice. And finally, perhaps something that is more relevant to the European context than perhaps in Asia or Australia is that Europe's nature is heavily degraded, of course. Most of our ecosystems and wildlife today live in heavily modified environments where keeping them present, keeping them alive, often requires very intense management. And we like to think that rewilding offers a more cost-effective approach to achieving the same goals of nature recovery by letting nature lead the process and restore itself rather than having humans do the work with machinery, with labor, etc. And we're at Rewilding Europe actually doing this and showcasing that in now 11 landscapes across the continent. You can see them mapped here, and we're exploring the feasibility of working in an additional 3 landscapes right at the moment. So it's quite a diverse portfolio of landscapes where we're experimenting with this rewilding approach. And what we're doing in practice is restoring ecosystem processes, natural processes, letting forests grow old, but also sometimes accelerating that with veteranization, for example, removing barriers and obstacles. Europe is full of fences that often are not longer used anymore. We are re-wetting drained wetlands, removing obsolete dams. So lots of work on the actual processes happening in the ecosystems, bringing back large herbivores, and also fostering the comeback of keystone species, either by facilitating coexistence or active reintroductions, for example. So that's the ecological part of the work. But as I was saying before, working with people is really central. And so a second major pillar of our strategy and our practice is fostering and supporting local entrepreneurs and local communities to expand the economic benefits and as well as the less tangible or more cultural benefits of wilder nature in the rural communities where we work. So we have business-oriented staff that provide funding, capacity building, networking to local entrepreneurs to build stronger nature-based economies in the rural areas where we are working. And finally, we need to make people proud of living in wilder landscapes with more interesting, richer, sometimes more complex environments in which to live. And so a third major pillar, of course, is building engagement. Locally would be the priority, but we also need to change the narrative and spread the word that you can live in a wilder continent, that people can thrive together with thriving wild nature. And that really is the big challenge that's ahead of us, breaking down this artificial barrier that we have between us humans and nature. And so as a conclusion, this is the definition of rewilding that we have on our website. I'll let you look it up if you have time. But you can see that, of course, it's a restoration approach with some specifics to it compared with more traditional restoration or conservation, particularly in a very management intense European context, but it's also a new way to think about our relationship with nature. And I think we should really not forget that key part where rewilding is also about us. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Fabien. It was quite a challenge to to explain rewilding in 7 minutes, and you've done it quite brilliantly. I really look forward to poring over your slides. There's always so much to learn. This is what I call the rewilding education that I'm undergoing, and poring over your slides and some of those papers, which are clearly so rich. But I also want to sleep in that tent and drink a glass of that Altano wine in the Douro Valley or the Coa Valley. So there's so much joy in this movement, and so much to learn, and so many wonderful people and places to go. So it feels like sort of when you get involved in the rewilding movement, it opens up this whole new way of looking at so many different parts of life. And you've really done that for us. Thank you so much. So next, Andrew Tilker, Dr. Andrew Tilker from Rewild. Andrew, for you to explain animating the carbon cycle, over to you.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks again for having me and letting me present today. I'm going to be talking briefly about animating the carbon cycle, how trophic rewilding can help mitigate climate change within a nature-based solutions framework. So to meet the target that was adopted in the Paris Agreement, we need to obtain net zero emissions, but we also need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and store it somewhere on the planet. So in addition to stopping fossil fuel emissions, we actually have to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And that's because there's so much CO2 currently in the atmosphere that will remain trapped there. And current estimates indicate that we need a total of around 400 to 500 gigatons of CO2 negative emissions between 2030 and 2100. And if you do the math, that works out to about 10 to 12 gigatons of CO2 per year within that time frame. Many people have turned to technological examples of how this could happen. Not a day goes by probably when we don't hear something in the news about a new technology that's meant to actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere. But there are also natural solutions. So one proposed way to do this is to use biodiversity and ecosystems to help address the climate crisis. And these approaches are referred to as nature-based or natural climate solutions. And they can help us in two ways. First, nature-based solutions can help us in avoided emissions. They help us not put more CO2 in the atmosphere by protecting forests, wetlands, grasslands, and seascapes, although that isn't in the figure that I have on the screen. We can help avoid around 5 gigatons of CO2 per year in the atmosphere. And you see that on the left-hand side of this figure. But nature-based solutions can also enhance CO2 sinks. So by managing working landscapes in a more effective and efficient way, including things like agriculture and timber, and by restoring habitats, we can remove a further 5 gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere. So we're still short of our goal of where we need to be. We have around 1 or 2 gigatons of CO2 shortfall, but at least we're getting close to where we need to be through these nature-based approaches that I have on the screen. But there's a problem with this picture, and the problem is, what about the wild animals? Animals are key components of ecosystems, and they should be part of the conversation when it comes to nature-based solutions. We shouldn't be talking about landscapes without the things that are actually living in these landscapes, essentially. And one reason animals haven't figured prominently into nature-based solution approaches is because they have low biomass. So if you look at the classic trophic pyramid that many of you will have seen in high school or college science classes, you'll see that plants on the very bottom layer are much more abundant than the animal herbivores and carnivores at the higher trophic levels. And the classic view in ecology has been that because animals have much lower total biomass compared to things like plants, they have little carbon in their bodies, and therefore they don't make a big difference when it comes to carbon storage capacities in the big scheme of things. But the problem with this is that it overlooks the fact that ecosystems are dynamic, fluid systems, and that animals often have impacts on ecosystems that are disproportionate to their abundance. So, on the figure on the right, this tangled network, you can see that animals impact plant communities, and in turn, they impact entire ecosystems and landscapes through that tangled network of interactions. And they do this in ways that can have really significant implications for ecosystem functioning and therefore carbon storage. And there are many ways in which animals do this. Um, for example, herbivores eat vegetation, which can, in some contexts, provide space for more carbon-dense trees to grow. Large mammals can trample and compact soil in ways that reduce microbial decomposition, in which can store more organic material in the soil. There are, 1,000 examples that I could go through, but I'll have to leave that for another presentation. And I should quickly mention that although I'm not focusing on this heavily in this talk, we shouldn't forget about the marine realm. There's something called the whale pump, in which whales cycle material through the water column, and this has enormous implications for how carbon is stored in oceans globally. So one of the primary ways that animals impact for ecosystems, one of the ways that most people think of probably first is as important seed dispersers. So large and medium-sized mammals and birds feed on fruit. The seeds pass through the animal and then are deposited often very far away from the original location where that seed was consumed. And so by consuming seeds and spreading them out through a landscape, these animals are really critical to maintaining healthy forest ecosystems. And a number of studies have shown that seeds that are most likely to be consumed and dispersed by large mammals and birds are exactly those trees that store the most carbon. These trees often have large seeds that are consumed primarily or sometimes only by large animal species, and they usually have dense wood that's especially important for long-term carbon storage. And so a number of simulation studies have shown that with the extinction of these large frugivores, forest composition fundamentally changes with a shift to softwood trees that store less carbon. And you can see this in the slides that I have on the screen. There was a paper a few years ago in Thailand, actually, that used a modeling approach and combined this with a long-term vegetation plot data set to look at how loss of large frugivores, such as mammals and primates and hornbills, alter forest composition and therefore carbon storage. And what they found is that by removing, in a modeling sense, not actually, by removing these large frugivores and primates, carbon storage reduced from between 2.4 to 3%, depending on the defaunation scenario applied. And so just by removing these large mammals from the ecosystem, it can have pretty significant effects on carbon storage. Another example, animals also impact their environment through more direct means. For example, studies have shown that in areas without elephants, the forest understory gets very dense and overgrown. When these elephants are present, they thin the forest out, both by eating vegetation and by physically creating open areas. And in areas with more open forest, you find more carbon dense trees. And the reason for that is that dense, thick understory vegetation actually hinders the germination and growth of carbon dense trees. And so the net effect is that in areas with elephants, up to a point, you can have more than 50% more tree biomass and therefore greatly enhanced carbon storage capacities. And so a few years ago, a group of scientists led by the GRA and also by Oz Schmidt from Yale tried to put science and numbers behind these scenarios. And they used very complex modeling approaches to try to look analytically at the actual effect of removing or restoring large animals to ecosystems and how that impacts carbon storage in those ecosystems. And the model is extremely complex. And so obviously, I'm not going to go through that here. Although if anybody's interested, you can reach out to me or members of the GRA and we can go through this in more detail if that is of interest to you. But the short story is that these scientists actually put a quantitative framework to what happens when you take animals out of an ecosystem or add them back into an ecosystem and how that impacts potential carbon storage in those ecosystems. Now, if you put all of the effects together in which animals can impact ecosystems and look at how that potentially impacts carbon storage, we find that there's a total of approximately 6.5 gigatons of CO2 that is accounted for just by animals because of how they are interacting with their environments. But again, to go back to an earlier point, what is surprising is that none of this is accounted for in existing nature-based solution frameworks. And so some of this might be captured indirectly, but the key takeaway here is that there's an enormous amount of carbon storage potential that is not directly accounted for in nature-based approaches to the climate crisis. And this hints at the power that rewilding and conservation approaches, including reintroducing species where they've been lost, can have on ecosystems and for our approaches to the global climate crisis. And this paper was published a few years ago in Nature Climate Change. And so the takeaway from this is that species are key to healthy ecosystems and therefore maximizing carbon storage at a global scale. And we really need a change in mindset. We need to see species not as these unwitting victims on a climate change ship that can escape and are suffering the effects, but really as active agents in the story. And again, this change in mindset is something that the GRA the Global Rewilding Alliance, has been talking about for a while, the past few years. And I think we're starting to see more and more people actually perceive animals as active agents that have an impact in how this climate change story unfolds in the long term. And species recovery and rewilding are going to be absolutely essential to meet the 1.5 degree global warming target that was laid out in the Paris Climate Accords. And so just to wrap up, rewilding offers vast potential to actually address climate change within a nature-based solutions framework. And we need to be thinking of animals and restoring animals within ecosystems as a vital component of how we're going to deal with the climate crisis. It's a key part of the nature-based solutions framework. And next steps within the animating the carbon cycle framework are going to be to actually dig down into these modeling frameworks in more detail and assess how regional hotspots can be impacted by rewilding specific animal communities and how that changes carbon storage within those hotspots. So rather than going at this at a very high level, we're actually going to start getting more into the details and how this works at a site-specific way. And that's really interesting because it's going to shed new light into how rewilding animals into those specific ecosystems can have benefits for the climate crisis. And with that, I just want to say thank you very much for your time and attention. And I'm happy to take questions later, and you can always reach out to me with questions. Thank you.
So thank you, Andrew. That was a brilliant overview of a very complex field. I learned a new word, detritivores. So that's good. That's a new part of my rewilding education. And really just this message about wild animals and intact ecosystems being the oldest and most secure and probably the cheapest climate technology that we have available. Um, and I would just add one thing to what you've said, Andrew, which is that we are now applying the Yale GRA model in 5 landscapes around the world. So with bison in Romania, with forest elephants in the Congo Basin, and with a range of different animals in Chile, Argentina, and Mexico. And each case study is looking deliberately at a different landscape, a different set of animals, to build up our evidence base and form the foundation for the next phase, as Andrew described it, which is this global study of the hotspots, the potential animating carbon cycle hotspots, where the return of wild animals can potentially create the biggest benefit for the global climate. And I'm happy to say that we are in conversations about funding that piece of work, and excuse me, and there is some healthy interest in supporting that work. So we hope to be able to have a good announcement, a positive announcement on that in the coming months. Anyway, so that just a little bit more detail there on what's going on behind the scenes. Our next speaker is Pablo Cinovas, Country Director for Cambodia Program at Fauna and Flora International. Very lucky to have you here with us today, Pablo. I think you're in Cambodia as we speak, and you're going to be giving us a rewilding practitioner's perspective from somebody in Southeast Asia. So the floor is yours, Pablo.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, everybody from Cambodia. Really good to be here, and thank you to the Global Rewilding Alliance and Rewild for organizing this webinar. I work with Fauna and Flora, a conservation NGO, and this is the team in Cambodia with whom I have the pleasure to work. Here, I'm doing one of the most enjoyable parts of my job, and also the subject of this brief talk. This is a story, a very condensed story, of one of the world's rarest crocodiles. And also, it is a story about how bringing this species back is helping protect forests and wetlands. I'm just wondering, are you seeing the right slide or are you seeing the presentation slide?
Yeah, we're seeing you holding a crocodile very courageously.
Okay, yeah. Now, the Siamese crocodile was once widespread across Southeast Asia. Now the species is critically endangered and extirpated from most of its range. Here on this slide, you can see a museum specimen, and on the label, it reads, the species was thought to be extinct in the wild at the time when it was prepared. So that gives you an idea of how rare the species is. Now, an expedition in Cambodia's Cardamom Mountains in the year 2000 found that the species was in fact not extinct as feared. Cambodia is in fact home to the largest remaining wild population of the species, and this remaining population is particularly in the remote wetlands and rivers of the Cardamom Mountains in the southwestern part of the country. But this landscape, like many others around the world, is affected by threats such as habitat degradation, land use change, and infrastructure development. At the same time, the Siamese crocodile are a species that is culturally significant in Cambodia and ecologically vital as an apex wetland predator. This is a relief from Angkor Wat, the Angkor temples in Cambodia. So as part of our efforts to help the population recover, we support community-led protection of key habitats. These are some of the community wardens that are helping protect really important habitats for the species and also monitor the species. We also conduct nest monitoring annually. And here you can see a nest of Siamese crocodile in the wild, which, as this graph shows, is quite rare to find. Over the past couple of decades, we have been finding very few nests in the wild. You can see a slight increase in recent years, but still very low numbers. And so to help the population bounce back, given those very low levels of reproduction in the wild, we started a decade ago or so a conservation breeding program. And this is the breeding facility where we breed the species in captivity. Here you can see some of the hatchling bulls. And then once the hatchlings reach a certain age, they are ready for release back into the wild. We have been improving what we do at the breeding center, and this is a very central part of the program. And as you can see on this graph, there are very clear results to that. And the number of hatchlings has increased significantly over the years. Now, once crocodiles reach about a meter, we prepare them for release into the wild. And this involves transporting them to remote locations inside baskets. And this is an interesting solution adapted to what's available in Cambodia. Now, those baskets with crocodiles need to be taken to very remote areas. This is one of the sites to where we need to transport these crocodiles. That involves first a day or so by car, as far as the road can get us, and then several hours on the back of mopeds through the jungle to get to the location, including crossing rivers and carrying the mopeds with the crocodiles across those rivers. Here you can see a pre-release enclosure where we keep the crocodiles for some time before we set them free. So far, we have released over 200 crocodiles in Cambodia, which is actually roughly half the estimated wild population. One of the improvements that we have introduced recently is the use of acoustic telemetry. This is an acoustic transmitter that transmits ultrasounds, and through receptors such as these, which we install along the river, we can then understand the fate of those crocodiles after release. And it is thanks to efforts like this, monitoring efforts like this, including the nest monitoring as well, that we are collecting growing evidence of the success in the wild of this project. Here, some examples of the success as picked up by the media. The project has been heralded as one of the few positive conservation stories coming out of the region. However, threats to habitats continue, and so we are by no means complacent. And those threats actually make this project all the more important and relevant. The crocodiles are acting as flagship species, essentially, to help protect wetland and rainforest ecosystems. And these are, of course, major carbon sinks. In addition to that, as top predators, crocodiles contribute to maintaining balanced ecosystems, which in turn leads to improved carbon storage. And so we could say, and this follows quite well from Andrew's presentation, that this is a living example of animating the carbon cycle. Siamese crocodile conservation in this example shows how species protection and reintroduction can help rewild landscapes and in turn recover and protect all the other biodiversity that they support. At the same time, it also shows how species protection and recovery can rewild, can help integrate local communities into these conservation strategies, which is a very, very essential part of this project. And I will just leave you with, if I can play this, with a little video of a Siamese crocodile swimming free in the wild in Cambodia. And with that, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pablo. It's so great to see a crocodile in the wild that you have bred, helping these trophic cascades recreating the health of that whole ecosystem. And as you say, acting as an emblem for the protection of those amazing ecosystems. I have so many questions. Great results from your breeding in 2024. It looks exponential. I hope that continues. And clearly, this is a key example of what we want to do in the next phase with the hotspot study of identifying these particular places on the planet where, by doing a bit of the work that you're doing, by reintroducing some key species, we can get these trophic cascades, healthy ecosystems going again, and therefore enabling so much carbon to be drawn down. And I'm sure we'd love to partner with you on that once we get it off the ground. So thank you so much. I have so many questions about, how this is going down with policymakers. Is this having ripple out effects on, for example, the establishment of protected areas and the re-establishment of whole ecosystems? I'm really interested in your kind of like theory of change, really. But perhaps we can cover some of that in the Q&A. And now our final presentation, we're back to you, Andrew, covering, thank you very much for Dr. Ashley Brooks, who's unable to be here today to give another rewilding practitioner's perspective from Southeast Asia. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, everyone. It's hard to follow cute Siamese crocodiles, but I will certainly do my best. So I'm going to give a very short overview on rewilding in the context of national and regional policies across Southeast Asia. This is a presentation that my colleague Ashley Brooks was going to give, but I'm stepping in because he had to step out. So let's dive right in. I mean, many of you will be aware of this, but Southeast Asia is an incredibly biodiverse region. The statistics are remarkable. It's 1 in 5 species globally, 15% of the world's tropical forests, the highest rate of tropical bird and mammal endemism globally, and yet it only covers 3% of the planet. So there's a lot crammed into a lot of diversity crammed into a very small area. But it also faces some challenges. It's very crowded. There are more people in Southeast Asia than the Amazon and the Congo basins combined. It's got a very complicated spatial context with many small islands, small space. There's a large biodiversity funding gap, and maybe most challenging, there's often low political will and national drive for biodiversity conservation in the face of many other national competing priorities such as development. So in terms of regional trends, there have been some analyses that have tried to look at kind of where things are going and tried to put some numbers behind these. And they're quite shocking. Up to 42% of regional species are expected to be lost by 2100 under a business as usual scenario. And predicted biodiversity loss could potentially put 63% of regional GDP at risk, which is higher than the global average. A large number of ecosystems are unprotected, almost 90%, and almost 50 million hectares of KBA areas are unprotected within the region. And of course, many of you have heard about this, but the region has one of the highest deforestation rates anywhere in the world. So a lot has been lost already. We're at a very tenuous starting point, and a lot will be lost based on current trends. And this is going to get worse in the future. So it's a bit of a dark picture in terms of biodiversity for one of the most critical biodiversity hotspots on the planet. there are many stages and contexts for where different countries and different regions fit within this kind of biodiversity loss spectrum. There are some countries that have very relatively intact ecosystems and have retained considerable amounts of their biodiversity. Thailand is the one that springs to mind because I've worked there. There are also countries that have intact forest but have lost a large part of their biodiversity, especially large mammals and birds. Countries like Vietnam, Laos, Malaysia. There are also countries that have highly fragmented ecosystems, and have lost a lot, like the Philippines. And so, basically, the goal of or the purpose of this figure is to show that many across the region, countries are at very different places in terms of ecosystem intactness and what's left or what's been defaunated. And when we're thinking about rewilding at a country level, the places at the left-hand side of this figure are really the places that have the most potential, the countries that have lost their biodiversity. And so one of the questions that I get often is, when you're talking to policymakers or government officials, how do you convey the importance of rewilding? Why should people care, especially when there are competing economic development priorities in many parts of Southeast Asia? And there are many reasons for this. One is that there are biodiversity and protection reasons. Rewilding keystone species can restore ecosystems. It can rebalance ecosystems through the many ecological processes that, in part, I talked about in my earlier presentation. And national rewilding policies ensure that conservation priorities are not isolated or vulnerable to political shifts or underfunding. So this is why countries need to really think carefully about the importance of national rewilding and restoration policies, and not keep this at a project by project level. Of course, as we saw in the earlier animating the carbon cycle discussion, there's a huge implication for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Basically, healthy ecosystems are natural carbon sinks, and to have healthy ecosystems, we need healthy biodiversity within those ecosystems. And so by rewilding these ecosystems, we can actually restore them and strengthen ecosystem resilience into future climate shocks. And again, national rewilding policies can help ensure that climate strategies include these nature-based solution frameworks that have animals as a core part of those frameworks. And of course, uh, having healthy ecosystems with intact faunal communities has implications for enhanced ecosystem services and human well-being. Southeast Asia is incredibly has a very large population, and basically anyone everywhere at some level is relying on healthy ecosystems for ecosystem services. And so by contributing to healthy ecosystems, by having rewilded landscapes, we're improving water supplies, clean air, stable soil, pollinator services, a whole host of ecosystem services that people depend on directly or indirectly. And so policies that incorporate rewilding at a national level can help protect these essential ecosystem services. And this is especially true for rural and indigenous communities, which are often the most vulnerable. And finally, rewilding and protecting biodiversity does not have to be in competition to development. I personally think that this is a fallacy, that ecotourism provides a huge source of income potential for areas with healthy wildlife populations and in landscapes that are restored. And well-designed rewilding efforts have the potential to attract international tourism, create jobs, provide funding for conservation. And again, national policies can help deliver these economic benefits. And finally, it's important to mention cultural and ethical responsibility. Southeast Asia has incredibly diverse cultural and religious heritage. Often that's tied to many of the species that would be put back into landscapes. And it's important to honor the cultural identity and ancestral stewardship of many of these groups that would be directly involved in rewilding efforts, and the policies at a national level need to support this and have ethical commitments to repairing any ecological damage that are caused by human activities. So there's a big policy gap and limitations to rewilding. There's no explicit national commitment to rewilding. Most ASEAN countries only mention restoration without any explicit reference to rewilding. Wildlife reintroductions are clearly under prioritized across the region. And in many parts of Southeast Asia, restoration often becomes a tree planting exercise without considering what's living in those ecosystems. And again, to hammer this point home even further, we cannot be treating healthy ecosystems. We cannot be thinking of ecosystems as healthy without thinking carefully about having healthy animal wildlife communities within those ecosystems. And that's really missing across much of the region. There's a lack of integration between protected areas and broader landscapes. So many Southeast Asian countries have isolated protected areas that are not linked to other ecosystems. And this also impedes rewilding potential. And finally, there's weak legal and institutional frameworks for species reintroduction. And basically, many rewilding projects are NGO-led pilots that don't have full national backing. And if that project fails, there's no government accountability or adaptive management. And the blame often sits with the NGO. It's another reason we need to wrap rewilding more closely into national government-led political initiatives. And finally, there's also the risk of neglect of indigenous stewardship and community stewardship. And so it's critical that NGO and government projects don't alienate communities that could be natural allies in protecting rewilded landscapes moving forwards. And finally, there's also inadequate financing. Countries lack dedicated national rewilding funds, and rewilding is often seen as an expensive luxury and not a necessity for ecosystem resilience. And hopefully, with more national-driven policies and with more political will behind those national-level political frameworks, we can have rewilding being government-led at scale, and there's a huge opportunity for bending the curve, as we had another presenter say, behind the biodiversity crisis, and integrating that into management for addressing the climate crisis. And so I know I'm probably running over time, so I'm just going to leave it there and say thank you very much for your time and attention.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Andrew, for stepping in at the last minute. It's very, very helpful. So I'm not going to comment on what you've said. I think it was very self-evident. We do now have some time for questions, about 12 minutes for Q&A. We have some questions coming in the Q&A and one in the chat as well. I would just like to start by picking up the question about women and indigenous leaders in the space of rewilding. I'm acutely aware that all of the presenters on today's webinar are men, white men from the global north. This is something that we are very aware of, and we are actively working to make sure that we in future have more diversity and more representation from women and indigenous people in these events. Sometimes there's a sort of a lag in who is doing the work and who is leading these organizations, but we come across more and more organizations now that are working closely with indigenous leaders. And so there we are. I just wanted to acknowledge that question. It's an important question. Thank you for asking it. I recently came across an organization called the Amazon Conservation Team, who have an association of indigenous women who are working on rewilding across the Amazon. So there are more and more of these organizations that we're becoming aware of, but many of them focus in their place, doing their good thing, and aren't necessarily visible internationally, and that's something that we can help them with. So we have some questions. Would anybody on the panel like to take the question? We have one from Ralph Dixon in Singapore about whaling. Ralph, I would say that, you know, one of our alliance partners, Whale and Dolphin Conservation, is working hard on this, about trying to encourage these countries to stop whaling. There was some very good news from Iceland recently, where it was proposed to hunt quite a large number of fin whales this year, but the company that had the permission to do that has said that it's not going to do it this year. And given the change of sort of culture in Iceland over the last few years, worked on very steadily by organizations like Whale and Dolphin Conservation, showing that the majority of tourists and Icelandic people themselves do not favor whaling, it feels like this could be actually the last time that Iceland does any whaling. Norway, Japan, those are more complicated, and the Faroe Islands seems to be a sort of an outlier. But it feels like these things are ones where pressure builds and then it'll suddenly flip to a sort of a zero state. So I don't know if anybody else has anything to add on the whaling question or on any of the other questions that are coming up in the Q&A. We also have a question on evidence, scientific research comparing the cost of rewilding and artificial methods to restore carbon. Does anybody have any insight on that? And I'm not seeing anybody jumping in on that. So it's a good question, and I'm grateful for it. So I think part of what we want to do in the hotspot study is to look at how much it will cost in different landscapes to enable rewilding to draw down carbon, and then that will be possible to compare against a sort of technology approach. Our sense is that with all of the multiple ecosystem benefits that are provided by intact ecosystems, such as flood protection, drought protection, clean air, etc., that it will be looked at in the round. This will be by far the cheapest, but I think that Fabien, you're typing something. I don't think that work has been done thoroughly yet, but it's a good question.
Alistair, can I add something here?
Yes, please, Mark.
So an awful lot of money has been invested in what they call carbon capture and storage, and a technological approach, and in researching all sorts of wild schemes about space-based technology that can bounce sun rays back into the universe. And I think if a fraction of the money invested in unsuccessful CCS efforts had gone into restoring ecosystems, we would have sequestered a great deal more carbon, in fact. And so I think there are two points there. One is that the high expenditure in the technology-based approach, although of course research should continue, has proved to be a near universal failure. Whereas ecosystem restoration has showed its potential and its success in many cases. I think the argument should not simply be one of cost, but one of cost and co-benefit. So my challenge to the people who believe in a technological approach is to demonstrate they can work at scale on an affordable basis, and they can't do that for the present.
Thank you, Mark. So we have a question from Alistair Monument asking about how can we improve cooperation between organizations on things like the crocodile rewilding. Andrew, Pablo, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, in that question, thanks, Alistair. Very, very relevant, and I think something that we should do more of. We've been liaising with organizations across the country, including WWF, also CI, and others, and WCS particularly, on coordinating actions with different organizations working in different geographies within the country. So WWF working in Eastern Cambodia, Srepok, as Alistair mentions, and I think that there's certainly scope for collaboration. We did some joint monitoring there, Alistair, a few years ago, which led to the finding of crocodiles, and I think looking at how we can maybe work more together on protecting those crocodiles, and maybe replicating the model that we have been working on in the Cardamom Mountains, which we have actually started now replicating ourselves in northeastern Cambodia, in Virache National Park, and something we've done with for example, Rising Phoenix in another part of northern Cambodia. So certainly a lot of scope for more collaboration.
Thank you. Andrew, my impression is that Rewild does a lot of working with local organizations. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, that is fair to say. Our method of operating is really to support local partners in whatever way or means that could be. And so we try to play a key role in bringing sometimes very disparate partners together behind a common unified vision, and that includes rewilding. And so sometimes successful, sometimes not. There are always challenges in conservation, but it's a core approach of a value added that we try to bring working in the region.
Great. Fabien, you might want to comment on this as well, because Rewilding Europe is a federation of amazing organizations with this amazing combination of local action with help from the center, with all of the amazing stuff that you're doing at the center, as it were. Do you want to comment on this question of cooperation and so on?
Yeah, well, indeed. So Rewilding Europe is a European level initiative that acts as a central nexus, let's say, but the work in the field is done by local partner organizations that actually have their staff, their offices in the landscapes where we work, and that's really important. They're raising their families there, and they work in close partnership with a wide diversity of other local partners, other NGOs, local businesses, as I was mentioning in my presentation, and of course, protected area authorities, local politicians, and in the case of northern Sweden, for example, there was a question about this with indigenous communities around restoring traditional reindeer herding practices. So yeah, and on the economics aspect, I guess perhaps we are lucky in Europe on some aspects, like tourism. We of course have a huge market of tourists close by. A lot of those are also interested in the cultural aspects of local products, and we can tie this to nature as well. Sometimes it's tricky, but it can be done. The particular challenge we have is that a lot of, I would say, harmful land use models that are heavily subsidized to maintain a sort of status quo on agricultural uses, some various kinds of forestry, things like this. And that's one of the biggest impediments actually to rewilding. And so one of the sort of the big prizes that we're looking at are developing new business models that can be competitive in a context where there is less appetite and less funding for public subsidies for traditional land uses, and some growing need, for example, for land-based carbon storage. Biodiversity credits was raised in the Q&A. So all of these things we're looking at, but it's still very early days. And so we are back to the basics of tourism, local products, and working with partners in the context of the existing economic structures.
Thank you, Fabien. I think you've partly answered Bianca's question, which we don't have time to do another round because I want to move to Mark with some concluding comments in a moment. Yeah, great. So let's do that. Mark, over to you. Oh, I wanted to say we did have a question about slides. I believe that, well, hopefully all of you will agree to share your slides when we post this recording to YouTube. So keep an eye out for that. If you don't yet receive mailings from us, go to our website, which is globalrewilding.earth, globalrewilding.earth. Scroll to the bottom and you can sign up to receive our mailings, and then we will inform you when the recording is up on our YouTube channel, and that should be within the next week or so. And we will share the any presentations that the presenters are willing to share. So thank you very much. Over to you, Mark, to give your concluding comments.
Thank you, Alistair, and thanks first of all to all the presenters for a series of very fascinating but also very encouraging examples of rewilding in action, and in particular to you, Andrew, for having agreed to make two presentations and giving Ashley's presentation as if it was your own. So congratulations on that. And thanks also to Re.Wild for co-sponsoring this webinar. Now, I think that the important thing to note and underline is that saving what's left of wild nature is no longer enough. Given the state of biodiversity, given the trends that we're seeing, it will not be enough to simply try and protect the rest, although, of course, we need to try to do that. And instead, a lot of attention is turning now to the potential to actually restore ecosystems and restore biodiversity. And we're learning a great deal from the early concentration on that positive approach. We know that we can build on the link between climate change and biodiversity, that the greatest cause of climate change is, in fact, land use changes and agriculture. And the greatest potential for addressing climate change comes also from working on land, nature, and ecosystems. So we have the potential here for a double win. And what I take from the example of animating the carbon cycle, and from the admittedly not yet sufficient base of evidence drawn from that, is that, in fact, this is a potential for a real double win. It's a win for biodiversity, evidently, because that's the primary purpose of the rewilding, the putting back of near intact ecosystems, in the diversity that it enjoyed before the destruction started, but also doing so in a way that sequesters a serious amount of carbon from the atmosphere, and in ways that guarantee longer-term storage. We're beginning to see greater attention being paid to the notion of resilience, and the role of rewilding in ensuring resilience of nature and resilience of ecosystems is, I think, well established. But also in the difficult political times that we're living in today, this notion of resilience is a lot more politically acceptable, I think, than the notion of conservation on its own, and certainly the notion of protection. And a lot more people now are making the link between resilient ecosystems and security, protection from extreme events, from natural disasters, and the impacts that they have on humans. So I think that rewilding also offers us a way of presenting the nature challenge in ways that are politically acceptable across a fairly wide spectrum. And it's not just in the field of biology and ecosystem management that developments are taking place. We're seeing now a huge amount of innovation in the design of financial instruments and linking finance to performances on climate or nature indicators. So there's a huge potential for directing finance, particularly to the poorer countries, in ways that also help them build the resilience of their ecosystems. I think Alistair's point in the beginning that what we need is an approach that is based on glass being half full. Andrew, you in presenting Ashley's slides, you made the obvious point that we have a long way to go, and that the policy and legal framework is not there, the institutions are not there or not strong enough, the understanding of the topic is not strong enough. But the advances that have been made and the speed at which interest is growing in rewilding, I think, offers us a real encouragement. I think we need to rely on this positive narrative so that rewilding can grow to its full potential. The purpose of the Global Rewilding Alliance is, of course, to bring people with common interest together and to share best practice and learn from everybody else's experience. But it is also, and probably more important, about launching a movement or building a movement. And I think that we have enough promising examples, enough interest. This interest is growing fast enough that I think we can imagine a real rewilding movement taking off and being a very important part of the broader ecosystem restoration movement. Within that, I think the approach illustrated of the animating the carbon cycle, restoring the animals to the ecosystem is something that I think can really be a rallying point around which this movement can crystallize. So thank you all for your contributions. Thank you all for all the participants for your presence, and we look forward to remaining in touch with you. Thank you.